Perfect. So starting on your right, we have Professor Sir Mark Walport. Mark is the Chief Executive of UK Research and Innovation, which is the body responsible for the public funding of research and innovation. And it has just celebrated its one-year anniversary. Previously, Mark was the UK government's Chief Scientific Advisor, and before that, Director of the Wellcome Trust. Until 2003, Mark was Professor of Medicine and Head of the Division of Medicine at Imperial College here in London. Next to Mark is Dr. Hayaatun Sillem. Dr. Hayaatun is the Chief Executive of the Royal Academy of Engineering, where she has worked since 2006. She comes from a background in biochemical sciences and previously served as the Committee Specialist and Specialist Advisor to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. And then we have Professor Sir Adrian Smith. This is actually his stage because Sir Adrian is the Director and CEO of the Alan Turing Institute. Previously Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, he also served as Director General Knowledge and Innovation in what is now the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So I hope you'll agree with me, there's no better panel than this to discuss the important topic of the role of research in the UK economy. So to kick off that discussion, I wanted to start with actually asking you, Sir Mark, not least for the benefit of some of the international visitors that might have joined us today, just to talk a little bit about the landscape for UK research on that wonderful moment, which is the happy birthday to UKRI.
Yes, well, we're one, so we can just about toddle. But actually, let me just say a little bit about UK Research and Innovation, because it is exactly the right organisation for what we're talking about today. So what we're bringing together is over 100 years of the research support in the United Kingdom. And in 2015, Paul Nurse did a report looking at the coherence of our research and innovation system and recognising that we don't live in a world siloed by disciplines in the same way anymore. The opportunity to bring together the 7 research councils, so everything from the Medical Research Council through the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council through to the Social Sciences and the Arts and Humanities, was really important so that we can actually tackle issues in an interdisciplinary fashion. And if I had to summarise in 3 words what we're all about, we're about knowledge with impact. So the other thing that we bring together is Innovate UK, which Priya is very involved with, because it's one thing to discover knowledge, but then the important thing for society, particularly since there's £7.5 billion a year of taxpayer money going through UK research and innovation each year, is that that knowledge has impact, be it cultural impact, be it impact in the knowledge economy. It's that whole range. And we're only going to achieve that if we work coherently. And when I look through the sort of breadth of our portfolio in AI, data science, autonomy, it's sort of breathtaking. It's everything from work with the Alan Turing Institute and the British Library, living with machines. So understanding the history of previous revolutions, using modern technology to do it, and learning the lessons which are still relevant today. How can we deliver public services better? So we have a program on AI and data science for engineering, health science and government. And that brings together a series of government departments. And then I think probably the most important thing of all, in truth, is skills. At the end of the day, we will flourish or not depending on our skills. And so a very important part of our activity is centres for doctoral training. So training PhD students. As a part of the sector deal, we have 1,000 new PhD students in AI in the broadest sense. And I think it's worth reflecting that although I don't think this is about the sort of whole spectrum of education, maths A-levels are absolutely critical to this. And although the numbers are going up, there were about 90,000 entries to maths A-levels in 2018. And it brings into focus gender issues because equality, diversity, inclusion is really critical to this, and it's 60% men, 40% women roughly were going in. do maths entry, and further maths, it's only about 17,000 people that do further maths. So that's critical to the pipeline. We kick in when it comes to postgraduate training, and I think it's one of the most important things we do.
Thank you so much, Sir Mark. One of the great sort of visible embodiments of what you referred to there as the AI sector deal for the UK government is, of course, the Turing Institute. And I'd love to maybe get you to talk a little bit, Adrian, about how the Turing Institute came about and what it is that is driving your role, particularly in relation to the broader UK economy.
Before I get on to Turing explicitly, can I just add a bit to Mark's overview of the UK funding research landscape? Because we actually run a twofold system. There are the considerable sums of money that go through Mark and UKRI, but there are also considerable sums of money that go directly into the universities. And for the overseas, this is the so-called dual support system. There is a funding stream, in a sense, which the universities earn based on past performance, whereas what UKRI are dishing out, in some sense, is funding in terms of research promise for the future. And this is a very important way in which the system is balanced in the UK. But the relevance to the Turing story is what we have got in the UK is a tremendous national asset in our universities. Our universities are, to a large extent, the research engine. Okay, pause. Turing was set up, it's been about 3 years old now. It arose from a suggestion from the great Magud, who composed the Council for Science and Technology, which advises prime ministers and chancellors of the Exchequer from time to time on what's coming over the horizon that the UK needs to take seriously. And it was a letter from that Council for Science and Technology at the time when David Cameron was the Prime Minister and George Osborne was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that basically went as follows. Okay, we've always had data, and we've always had problems, and people have always mucked about with data to get insight and solve problems, but there's something new on the block. It's just the sheer scale of data that's out there, coupled with the scale of computing power, which in a sense then creates a playground for doing clever things. And we call those clever things by different names: data science, AI, machine learning, whatever. But this is coming over the hill, the Council for Science and Technology said. We in the UK are terrific at the basic disciplines in mathematics, computer science, software engineering. We should have an institute that attempts to bring this together at scale so that we somehow harness, convene, and broker more than the sum of the parts of the expertise within the UK. So the basic way, one of the key ways in which Turing functions is through university partners. We now have 13 university partners. We don't own hordes of research staff. We have some research software engineers, we have some young research fellows, but the main academic hitting power are secondments from our 13 partner institutions. And we call these Turing Fellows, and they might turn up for a day or 2 days or come from blocks of time across multidisciplines. And we, like a production line in a sense, it's not quite like this, we assemble them to attack big problems. We don't deal with small problems, so ambition. Let's revolutionize the NHS. Let's totally transform sectors of our public life using the data that's out there. So at the moment, I think we have getting on for 400 Turing Fellows. Thank goodness they're not all there at the same time, because the space only holds about 250. But they are the main academic resource, and we convene them around challenges which may be to do with the economy, may be to do with health, defense and security, new emerging fields in a sense. The whole of engineering, civil engineering, infrastructures, that world is being changed by sensors and data collection in almost every realm you can think of. So in a sense, via Turing, we've invented a new discipline, data-centric engineering. So we're looking at scale, at big challenges. We have non-university partners who come in for specific reasons, and I think maybe later we talk a bit about the corporate world and how it engages with the world of research. but we have strategic relationships with banks, with computer manufacturing and design companies, and with a whole range of healthcare and other companies. So Turing is still a startup in a way. This is a vast field. We're boiling the ocean if we're trying to solve all society's problems, but essentially we're harnessing UK brainpower in this area to attack major challenges for the public good. Will that do for now?
That's fantastic, and we're going to come back to some of those themes in a second. I wanted to start talking about one of the perhaps tensions that's out there when we're talking about research in the UK economy, which is a potential either or between the value of fundamental science, fundamental research, and then research that can perhaps have an application in the broader world, and one might lead that to say has a more significant impact potentially on the UK economy. Hayaatun, I wondered if you might be able to start to address that point and give us a sense of your perspective on that.
Absolutely. So, of course, the short answer is it's an entirely symbiotic relationship. But just to frame it a bit more, coming from the Royal Academy of Engineering, we are particularly interested in research that is closer to market, closer to end user, and, of course, innovation, by which I mean the process by which we get the fruits of research out into use through new or improved products, services, processes. And that's a really, really key way in which we capture the value from these incredible strengths in our university system and in discovery science. And going back a bit, I think there has been a perception that in the UK we tend to particularly prize our very great brains who are active in the end, that's sort of often termed pure science or discovery science, that's somehow a more sort of noble endeavor, perhaps a higher intellectual content. And of course, the lived experience of so many who work at that nearer market and that user-inspired section of our research community is that working with industry, working with patients, working with other sorts of end users, policymakers, is an amazingly rich seam of really intellectually challenging research questions. And of course, it's also really, really important that we look at some of the huge societal challenges we face. Adrian referred to a few just now. We have today's announcement around the net zero emissions target for carbon emissions for 2050. And of course, you think about the kinds of tools that we might need at our disposal to really help us achieve that. So I'm really pleased to say that we do see changes. That is it's a perception that persists, but in fact, we've seen a real breaking down of some of those silos. I think that the fact that universities are increasingly focused on impact as one of the indicators of research excellence has made a difference. I think the fact that activities like CogX and lots of other activities have helped to really celebrate the accomplishments of entrepreneurs who are commercializing and delivering value from our huge achievements in research. That's made a difference. And I also think the fact that we've got people who are coming into the education research system now, a new generation who are perhaps more motivated by social impact than some of us were when we entered the profession, is also changing the culture. I think when you look at funding, which is another of the areas where we've probably historically had a bit of a challenge, so the perception is that in the UK has not necessarily invested as much in that later stage research and the innovation piece as much as some of our competitors or comparator countries, depending on how you want to look at it. And of course, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund has been a hugely important development. So, it's a really significant new direction for the UK, and we have to make sure that's successful. But I do think there is some residual concern over the amount of funding that is kind of left over for those entrepreneurs and SMEs in particular who are out there doing fantastic activities that could be more research intensive, already are research intensive, and their ability to access funding that isn't attached to some sort of directed funding program. So I think the last publicly available stats, apologies if I'm not up to date, were that for 2017-18, Innovate UK's budget had around 6% available for open calls. Obviously, that means we've got a squeeze on the ability to fund that kind of bottom-up innovation, entrepreneurial-based research that's happening. And I do think in that context, the fact that we're looking to our longer-term relationship with Europe and potentially loss of access to some European funding schemes that have been really quite important to some of our most innovative high-growth SMEs is important. So the SME instrument, which has been a really great source of relatively unrestricted funding for some of those really innovation-intensive SMEs, is something we need to think very hard about.
I'm going to come back to the issues you've rightly highlighted about later stage R&D, but Mark, please.
I just want to pick up this very artificial distinction between discovery and application. So Abraham Flexner in 1939 wrote an article for Harper's Magazine, which was entitled "The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge." Now, we really wouldn't be sitting in this room having this conversation if not for the contribution that quantum mechanics made to our understanding of the inner workers of the atom. And we wouldn't be here having this conversation without CERN, because it was Tim Berners-Lee who's solving the problems of communication and data handling that went with CERN, who invented the World Wide Web. Fabiola Gianotti, the Director General of CERN, was over talking at the Science Museum recently and made those points really very effectively indeed. We have to continue to discover things, but what we also have to do is, wherever possible, make sure that they are made useful. And we don't know when things are discovered whether they're going to be useful or not. And so an important part of our activity is actually funding researchers, as Adrian says, in universities predominantly, but across the whole sort of system, to discover stuff. And I just want to pick up your point rather specifically about Innovate UK, which is that Innovate is moving effectively all of its response-made funding to open competitions, recognising that the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which has grown, is fairly directed. But again, if you look at the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, Next Generation Services, Audience of the Future, Transforming Construction, Transforming Food Production, in every one of these, AI, data science, autonomy is intrinsic and important.
Adrian, I think you want to come in.
Yeah.
Can I add to the "we wouldn't be here unless"? Since you're in my Turing pavilion, we wouldn't be here without Alan Turing. And if you think back to the wartime Turing, the cracking of the Enigma machine, etc., there's a twofold thing. One is abstract algebra, and the other was probability theory that were brought together to win the war. So this division between pure and applied, I think, is nonsense. When I was an active researcher, I proved theorems in the morning and I did applied things in the afternoon. It's not a right distinction. So put it to bed.
Can I just,
Hayaatun, please.
just one more little lob in there. I wholeheartedly agree when it comes to sort of the philosophical distinction that both of Sir Mark's and Sir Adrian's comments are absolutely spot on. But nonetheless, the topic of today's panel is research in the economy. And I think when it comes to looking at how we capture value in the UK, actually looking specifically at that nearer market activity and that commercialization, entrepreneurial, business investment is absolutely pivotal. So it's not so much as to, about the inherent relationship, as just making sure that we are setting ourselves up well to make sure we maximize value capture in the UK.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. But I mean, of course, it's really important to recognize that one of the most important things that we supply is people with skills. So it is, and it's not actually all people who've done computer science degrees or maths degrees. It's engineers, it's physical scientists, all have a very important role. But you are absolutely right. If we don't turn this stuff into application and benefit for society, we're missing a trick. And our role in UKRI is to fund before the market kicks in. And that's always the challenge for government. We shouldn't be substituting for private investment, but at the early stages of the development of companies and applications, there is a market failure quite often, and that's where we have a critical role.
So I think the question that Hayaatun raises is a really good one to transition into, which is, how do you measure the impact of research on the UK economy? And Mark, I know this is something that UKRR thinks about a lot, not least given the £7.5 billion of taxpayers' money that supports research. So How do you measure it? How do you get that value for money for the taxpayer?
Well, I mean, you can't reduce it to a single number, but at the end of the day, we are part of the government's industrial strategy. Part of that, for example, is a target to increase UK R&D investment to 2.4% of GDP. Now, actually, if you look at what that comprises, about a third of that in most OECD countries is public investment and 2/3 private. So we have to work with business to make sure that we leverage, as it were, industry and business R&D. But at the end of the day, it's about actually measuring outputs, outcomes, and ultimately impacts. And I think historically, to be honest, there has been a bit too much focus on the inputs, how many grants, how much money. What we are collectively buying as taxpayers is the products of the research, the products of innovation. And so it is, I think, about the people that we train and educate, what happens to them, the discoveries that are made, how are those discoveries turned into benefit. And so it's a complex mixture of narrative and metrics. And to be honest, it's not a trivial problem. You know, measuring a £7.5 billion portfolio, which is split into thousands of grants, it's not an easy thing to do. But I think what we have to do is look at it rather specifically and not think we can come up with some single number that somehow says success or failure. But I think critical to all of us is that at the end of the day, we have a thriving economy and we have all the benefits of this technology. And I think there is another critical issue, which is diffusion. And so in the UK, the gap between the most productive and the least productive companies in almost every sector is quite broad, broader than in many other OECD countries. And so I think the question for everyone in and around this is that most people here are working at the cutting edge, or indeed in some cases at the bleeding edge. But the real question is, how do we diffuse it through the economy? And 80% of our economy is a service economy. The service economy is being absolutely transformed by all of this technology, and indeed the blurring between manufacturing and services is becoming ever greater. So it's not really a valid distinction anymore completely. So I think there's a big challenge there, which is how we make sure that all of these benefits diffuse not only in business terms, but also across the country. We have a very uneven economy.
Hayaatun, did you want to come in?
This is a topic I feel really personally very passionately about, and I'm glad as well that Mark, you put right up front there this false dichotomy. We talked about false dichotomy between pure and applied research, but the same applies to our kind of industrial categorizations, services, manufacturing. You know, the world has moved on. And one of the activities I'm involved with is the Made Smarter Commission, which is the UK's initiative to try to make sure that we really advance and maximize the opportunities associated with Industry 4.0. So it's a partnership between government, so our Secretary of State for Business co-chairs alongside Jürgen Meyer, who is the Chief Executive of Siemens UK. And I see that as, in a way, you know, a great complement to some of the absolutely world-leading research that happens both at the Turing Institute and across our university base. Sometimes, you know, I think we rightly celebrate the huge strengths we have in the brightest minds, and that the frontier research we undertake, we are actually world-leading in many of the disruptive technologies that are going to shape all of our futures. And I just wish we'd perhaps talk a little bit more about how we're going to make sure that those technologies are really deployed at scale across our public and private sectors, across the whole of the UK. Again, this place I mentioned is super important. Because ultimately, I tend to think that the bigger determinant of whether we're net beneficiaries or not of these new technologies or these disruptive technologies is going to be to do with our ability to adopt and deploy, because that's what's going to determine our competitiveness, our productivity. And you know, there are two big components to that are related. You've talked about diffusion. I might talk about adoption of existing innovational technologies, similar point. Lowering the barriers for SMEs. Not all of that long tail of lower productivity companies are going to be interested in adopting some of the technologies that are associated with Industry 4.0, but we have to be better at reaching those who have the potential to deploy them, but don't currently have the capacity or the bandwidth to do so. And the related point is skills. So skills to me is such an important piece of this picture, and I really think we have to move beyond this notion that skills stop at the point at which you've stopped your formal training or education. So it's not a conveyor belt. You make a decision at 14, and then you head off along, whether it's FE or whether it's HE, possibly do a postgraduate qualification, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we have a situation now where it's estimated that 80% of the workforce of 2030 are already out there. They've left full-time education. We have a situation where the pace of technology change means even those people who are expert today are going to have to move their mindset to have a sort of more continuous upgrading of skills, rather than a sense, well, I've got my qualifications and I just need to keep building a bit of experience behind me. And this is a major challenge for the UK. We don't have a culture, and we don't necessarily have very good systems of delivering those skills, helping organizations and individuals who can self-identify as being potentially disrupted by technology. We don't have really good systems to help them tackle it. So Made Smarter is doing a part of it, but there is so much more to do. I could keep talking on this all day, which you probably don't want me to do, so I'll stop at this point.
Adrian, please.
So not to overlap with many of the things that have been said, but just to point perhaps to a few other elements. Particularly in what's happening in data science and AI, you know, this is something that would not have been on the agenda or in the minds of those who were educated 30, 40 years ago and perhaps have senior management positions. So just one of the things we've done at Turing, which has been really eye-opening, we've held breakfasts for chairs and CEOs of FTSE 100 companies, and basically gave them a shock and tell story of what's happening in this world and the disruptive potential effects, with a view there, hopefully, that it trickles down through big organizations and people are put to seeing what that really means for them. The other point I would make is there really is a potential tension that we can't hide between excellence and place. Where you have concentrations of expertise, or where over the years big facilities have been put on campuses, you can't suddenly replicate that in a poorer or disadvantaged area of the country. So I really do think, and I know Mark knows this really well, it's not just it's skills, it's everything, but the notion of place and how we get a more equitable joining in of the great stuff that we're all interested in here, I think remains a big challenge. The other thing I would say is we are playing in an internationally competitive environment. So we have to understand not just the metrics of how we measure outcomes, but what are the metrics that actually attract inward investment and interest in the UK. And then you come back to this question of pure versus supply. It's actually the strength of the research base and the strength of the universities in the UK, which over and over comes up as a big reason why people want to invest and be in the UK. And the final thing, when you're looking at journeys to impact, the timescales can be very different in different areas. I mean, in some sense, the revolution that really kicked off in 2010, perhaps with deep learning algorithms as a transformation, that goes back ultimately hundreds of years, but certainly 1950, Turing's paper on Can Computers Think? You know, so journeys can take much longer in some arenas than others. In biomedical sciences, genomics, maybe it's faster. I mean, the whole world runs online now, and online encryption owes its basis to 200-year-old theorems in pure mathematics.
Mark,
it could take a long time in some.
Would you pick up specifically that point about place?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I don't think a place agenda and an excellence agenda are in conflict. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So firstly, I don't think you could simply drop a Turing Institute into every town in the country. It wouldn't work. But actually, when you look around the country, excellence is very widely distributed, but focused in different parts of the country. And we actually have a Strength in Places fund, which is a very specifically place-orientated fund in UK research innovation. And what we're looking for is 4 things to come together. So firstly, an area of business strength. Secondly, we're looking for allied strengths, typically in more than one university, because providing different sorts of skills. The third thing we're looking for is local support, because there needs to be local skin in the game. And the fourth magic ingredient to get clusters developed, because that's really what we're talking about, is leadership. But when you look across the country, for example, there's a tremendous compound semiconductor cluster in South Wales, where there's business, there's a new catapult that's been put there, there's great strengths there. You look across the whole of southern Scotland and there's a photonics cluster. These things developed organically. Look around Dundee, it's one of the most incredible life sciences clusters in Europe. Indeed, it's world class. And these things have sprung up around the country. And so what Strength in Places is about finding those real nuggets of excellence and building on them. But where I agree with Adrian is you can't simply, as it were, put a nanotechnology institute in every part of the country. That won't work. But Andrew Whitty, in about 5 years ago, did a piece of work looking across, mapping where the strengths are. And that effectively everywhere in the UK has got strengths. What we have to do is catalyse and build on them. And I mean, Adrian might say something about that. I think one of the important things about the Turing Institute from its foundation is that it sits in our National Library.
Yes,
and it seems to me that's a really interesting point.
Yes, no, I'd love to come back to that, but Hayaatun, I knew you wanted to come in there.
Okay, I'll keep it very brief. I very much agree with what you said, Sir Mark, because actually you look at engineering excellence, it's perhaps more widely distributed across the UK than many other areas of research excellence. And I take great encouragement from that. And I think that to some extent this is also about our will to be creative and to consider an inclusive role as a leading funder, for example, as being a challenge to make sure we find creative ways to couple investment to factors other than where we have existing research strength in particular disciplines. And I'm sure that's not what you're referring to, Sir Adrian, but in the context of engineering, you see, for example, where large companies are investing, having a huge bearing. So there's an interplay between that and our international trade activity. The UK has a very highly internationalized research base, and particularly when you look at business investment, extremely highly internationalized compared to comparative countries. So we need to be smart about thinking, how do we really sell the UK to some of those countries and companies who might be able to help catalyze new centers of excellence? How do we make sure we contribute to local strengths and skills that may not be about the postgraduate research workforce, but maybe about the ability to work alongside robots in factories in a more advanced way than currently might be the case amongst that particular workforce. And to use our innovation assets, perhaps in a slightly bolder way. So innovation assets can be as simple as we have a hospital, which could be really a focal point for making sure that we use novel approaches to genomics for medicine or for autonomous systems within hospitals, and you create new clusters based around existing assets. So I just think it's going to take creativity, but I'm more optimistic about our ability to couple place and excellence.
So let's come back to the point that Mark very rightly raised, which is actually cross-disciplinary approaches are one of the keys to unlocking the future economic potential. And he rightly noted that, of course, the Turing Institute sits in the British Library, just very close to where we are now in King's Cross. Would you tell us a bit about the importance of that cross-disciplinary perspective to what you're trying to achieve there?
Let me take a specific example that what would be the big worry in the whole world of, robots and algorithms and the rest of it? For some of us, it would be a rerun of GM crops or MMR vaccines. The Daily Mail splashes a headline, "Algorithm kills 500 old age pensioners." Me, maybe. What do we really need to think about so that we don't get into that space? And the terminology we tend to use in Turing what would it mean to have safe and ethical basis for algorithms? Now, as soon as you get into that kind of space, this ceases to be a purely technical problem. You need to understand ethical issues, you need to understand societal responses to things, behavioral responses, and you need to build that, in a sense, into the whole programs. But of course, there are big techie things. If you think of the things we worry about, biases, unfairness, lack of transparency, explicability, to get into those things, which are really core issues pervading the whole scene, is enormously multidisciplinary. It's not a purely techie thing. So one of the things we do, we run these data study groups where 80, 100 PhD students from all over the country come for a week, and they get problems pitched at them at the beginning of the week, and they vote which ones they want to work on, and then they try and solve the problems during the week. Now, all these problems are impossible, but because they're young PhD students, they don't realize that, so they go away and solve the problem. So it's all fantastic. But the first Monday morning, a huge amount of the time is spent teaching them about privacy and ethical and those kind of issues. So it's at the heart of the Turing thing that we are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. And one of the things that Mark alluded to earlier, a major project, Living with Machines, which in a sense is the digitization, the archive of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, led by humanities scholars. So we have everything from English history, social science, behavioral science, ethics, and the odd mathematician.
Fantastic.
They're all odd, yeah.
So I wanted to turn to something that I think has come out in all of your remarks so far, which is the importance of equality, diversity, and inclusion as we're thinking about achieving the full economic potential of research in the UK. I was particularly struck by a report that came out about 4 months ago saying that there's only 0.1% of university professors who come from a black female background, and that the majority of those had experienced discrimination at some point in their career. And this obviously comes in so many forms, and gender is one that's often talked about. I'd love just to talk for a few minutes, and I'll give everyone the opportunity to comment on how they're thinking about this really important issue of ED&I. And Mark, do you want to talk about it in the context of UKRI, first of all?
Absolutely. I mean, this really is a central issue for us. And I think it comes down to, if we're going to make progress, we've got to look at it from a broad culture aspect. In other words, it's not simply about how you interview better. It's actually about creating a work environment where talented people from all backgrounds can prosper. And so it's about everything. I mean, obviously, it goes back into the education pipeline and making sure that the pipeline itself delivers much better representation, and you can see universities changing in that respect. But it is actually about making laboratories the place where people from all backgrounds want to work. And so when I was at the Wellcome Trust, we did some work asking in terms of gender, the gender balance was about 50-50 of people doing PhDs, but then when you look 4 or 5 years afterwards, that gender balance had changed very extensively. And so we asked people, what is it that made you stay or leave, men and women? And actually the factors were very similar for both, though the effects were more marked for women, that they didn't like the culture of the laboratory. And so we have to tackle that. So it is actually about harassment and bullying, because if you don't crack that, it is actually about how we fund. So if you give people very short-term grants, that's much harder than if we give people the time to actually explore interesting and difficult problems. There are just so many different aspects to it. Jennifer Rubin, who's the executive chair of the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council, has taken on this as a very specific issue on behalf of us all. We are taking an evidence-based approach to it because, of course, everyone comes up with solutions, but the question is actually, is there any evidence those solutions are going to work? Because I think that's a big challenge. But, I mean, frankly, we're not, I think, going to make progress unless we tackle it in a very multidisciplinary way. And I just would go back to, if here we're talking about subjects where maths is quite important. And yet when you look at the ratio of women to men doing further maths A-level, it's 72% men to just under 30%, 28% women. And so it is, there is a pipeline problem. This is what the social scientists might call a wicked problem. I'm not sure I like the naming, but I mean, it's really important. It's not going to be solved overnight, but it's got to be solved a lot faster than we're doing it at the moment.
And if I may put my Innovate hat on for 1 second,
Yeah.
I think one other example that's worth highlighting is the work they've done to showcase the role models of women in innovation, supporting them both financially, but also giving the visibility to those amazing women who are doing fantastic, innovative work in startups and scale-ups across the UK. There's been a wonderful initiative recently to put purple plaques, as I'm sure you know,
Yes.
in schools where these successful women went to give the innovators of the future the role models to aspire to, which I think is wonderful.
And it's worth saying that the gender diversity of the executive chairs of the councils is much better than it has ever been.
Excellent. Please, Adrian.
Some of this depends on where you start the conversation. So clearly within universities you can change cultures and practices in terms of promotions and leave and so on. But just going back, I did last year a study on post-16 mathematics education in the UK, and I just give you one simple figure from 2016-17. Of all the people who did GCSE mathematics and got a grade A, and then went on to do something, let's say quantitative or physics, maths, whatever, something in that space, of the girls who got a grade A, only 50% went on to do something, let's call it related. Boys, 72%. Now, since that's your start pipeline for, as Mark has alluded several times, A-level maths, A-level physics, which is the pipeline through to the thing, unless you get that right back there. So I think urgent studies to see what it is that is causing that kind of bifurcation at the age of 15, 16.
Adrian and Mark, you've rightly identified a lot of the sort of cultural and contextual challenges there. There's one big area that I'd maybe ask you to touch on, Hayaatun, which is that purely and simply, the research that we have is surely going to be inferior if we're not having an inclusive range of people at the table. So talk me through how you're thinking about that and where you think this could have a positive economic impact on the UK economy.
Well, I think if you, I'm sure lots of people have heard of Caroline Criado Perez and her book Invisible Women. Really, it's the Bible if you want to look at all the case studies of where there's been a negative societal economic impact from lack of consideration, in that case of gender, in the context of all sorts of aspects of public and private life. And she makes some very powerful points around medical research, clinical research that I really hope people in our funding bodies are having a good look at. And as somebody who works in engineering, which unfortunately has a rather severe diversity deficit, so we have a profession that is 12% female, 8% black and minority ethnic engineer, it's something that I talk about a lot. I mean, obviously, I come from underrepresented groups as well, and that perhaps makes me especially interested. But one of the things we do a lot at the Academy is we work with companies, and within a company, one of the first things that needs to be done is you make the business case. You create that narrative that links it to the things that the board are going to care about. If I'm really honest, I think if we're in the business of disbursement of public funding or deployment of public funding, I think the moral case has to be front and center in our minds along with the business case. Because I don't really know what the argument against prioritizing diversity and inclusion across all of that activity is. I struggle with that. So I'm really pleased to see that there has been a much greater embracing of the issue across research and innovation. I think, again, if we look back into the past, there's been a bit of squeamishness about the idea that we might be having to compromise on excellence. How can we believe that a university system where less than 1% of professors, if you include men as well as women, are black, is the result of a system that is where excellence always prevails? And so I would say that all of us in leadership roles in the research and innovation community need to push ourselves very, very hard about the extent to which we are setting ourselves and others the right level of ambition, how hard we're pushing to deliver on that ambition. It's normal now that if you're in a major company, your executive team will have diversity inclusion metrics embedded in their performance appraisal. It'll be there, it'll be determining their bonus. It'll be there as one of the metrics for the assessment of the chair of the board. I really ask, have we come that far when you look at research and innovation? I think there is more to do. I think there's more to do in the symbolic things. Does every single government panel review have diversity represented? Does every single speech given by a senior person across government have balanced representation of excellence in all its forms of diversity? I don't think we're there yet, if I'm really honest with you, and I feel really passionately about this. I'm thrilled with the announcement that was made at the start of this week around the 18.5 million in AI skills, which had an explicit focus on a proactive mechanism to enhance the diversity of those who are going to possess those skills in the future. So, thinking more creatively about allowing people to transition in at a later stage of their career. We do need to look at the pipeline, but I'm also not prepared to wait until we've grown everyone from scratch. So, we're going to be working for a very, very long time. Let's bring people in, diversify at different stages. So, I think, that's just a sort of little flavour of the sorts of things that I would see from my vantage point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to make sure that we had time to talk about one other really important theme. We've talked quite extensively about the role of taxpayer money and government research in the UK economy. I wanted to talk about the role of corporate R&D for a second. You talked at the beginning, Adrian, about, I think, 13 industry partners that you have at the Turing. How important is that role of corporate R&D and indeed that intersection between universities, government-funded research and corporate R&D?
It was actually 13 university partners, but I mean, if we tot it up, and Nico could hold his fingers up for me down there, all the kind of industrial products, we have about 30, 40, 50. But there isn't a one-size-fits-all narrative. Big companies are in these things for very different reasons. Mark and I were at a dinner last night, in fact, where, in a sense, the corporate conversations and the business conversations are in the context of a campus like Harwell, where you have big facilities, world-leading things like synchrotrons, which act as a magnet for companies to work around. At the other end of the scale, we have a major strategic partner, which is one of the world's biggest banks. And why is their interest in interacting, say, with Turing? Largely, I would say, access to fabulously clever people. And why would we be interested in them? Well, the data that a major bank has is sort of microsecond information about what's happening in the economy, what's happening in people's heads. And so that fusion, I mean, there has to be something that brokers at the interface. If it's a big engineering company, it could be facilities, it could be expertise in robotics or whatever. So Turing may be particular, but in our case, it's basically the fact that we can broker and convene the mass of the brain power that the UK has in the arena. And as a one-stop shop, you can come and access that and start conversations. I think that would be our draw. The world we were in last night, it would be the fact we've invested in world-leading facilities that act as a magnet for corporates. But the narratives are very, very different for an engineering company than for a pharmaceutical company. In fact, they all want to talk to Turing because they've all got data. But
Please, Hayaatun.
Thank you. Just wanted to share some insights from a piece of work that we've been doing, which is based around talking to CTOs or budget holders for R&D amongst a whole range of companies across engineering and other science and technology-based sectors, both large and small, and asking them at this particular moment in time, what are the factors that make the UK a great place to invest, and what are the factors that are influencing whether they might disinvest in the UK or upscale investments outside the UK? As I referenced earlier, we have a system where 16% of our business investment in R&D is from overseas sources compared to, say, 8% in the US, 7% in Germany, I think. And that means that we have to consider the UK in its global context. And what we see is there are some things they love about the UK. So they love the quality of our skills base. There are some challenges over quantity, but the quality is superb. Similarly, the quality of our university research base, and nearly all of them really value their partnerships with universities. Thirdly, they love what Innovate UK does. So actually some really positive feedback for you and your colleagues at Innovate. Areas where they felt we fared less well compared to other countries. The ability to have a joined-up conversation across government. So the consolidation of the different funding councils and Innovate within UKRI is an important step forward. But of course, there are many different government departments and aspects of the public sector that will be factors that may influence the decision. And the kind of the story that we were told is when we look at other countries, they are make it easier to market themselves to us as a very attractive destination. They're doing the hard work of joining themselves up so that it's easy for us to see the offer. So that was one thing. Another thing that they said was that late stage, development, very kind of large scale development deployment funding was a bit of a gap. Acknowledging Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund may help to plug that. And then the third area that I think is also really interesting is procurement. So those of them that interface with government in the context of procurement, we're not overly complimentary about the experience of doing so. And I think it's a long-standing observation that in the UK, we do not maximise the fact that I think it's something extraordinary like 14% of GDP, an equivalent amount is spent on procurement in the UK and in public procurement. And that there is this huge opportunity to leverage a proportion of that to drive innovation and the sort of the risk appetite and perhaps skills of those people who are involved in public procurement mean that we don't maximise that opportunity, particularly compared to countries like the US.
So let's talk about that international element. It is so fundamental. Mark, do you want to talk a bit about that from your perspective?
I mean, let me just say something about company R&D at the moment, because I mean, we're going through an extraordinary industrial revolution. Companies that don't innovate are not likely to do well. And so, I mean, it's a mixture of adopting new technology, but it's also inventing new technology, using it in imaginative ways. But I think it's important to understand that the nature of company R&D is changing a bit as well. So we don't capture all of it, I think, with our current statistics. You know, we're used to measuring R&D in the traditional sectors, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, heavy engineering, automotive. But I mean, if you look at the companies around this part of the sort of knowledge quarter of London, innovation, research and development is in their lifeblood. And I think the other thing to recognise is that actually what's happening is big companies are often outsourcing their R&D by corporate venturing and by actually surveying the landscape of small companies and then effectively buying the ones that do successfully. And I think one of the big challenges actually for the UK is we are great at starting really innovative companies. We're not so good at growing them. And I think that's one of the big challenges, and that's where we need better access to capital. There's lots of capital floating around the world. It's actually about making sure that it sticks with our good companies here and enables them to grow. But I mean, on the international point, just look around here. Any decent laboratory, any company has people from all over the world. And so if we are to continue to thrive, we have to continue to be global, we have to continue to work on a global stage, we have to continue to collaborate internationally. This is not optional, it's critical to the future of the UK.
We're almost out of time, but I know we have one burning question at the front. So please, there's a mic just coming in. If you wouldn't mind, just a brief introduction.
Yeah, my name's Steve Podmore. I'm working on a project called Transform Global to create a sustainable development bank to address the SDGs. My question really is about the provision of long-term finance and risk capital at scale to deliver high-impact innovation and high-impact activity. And my question is really, what is your comment on the work of Merian and Mazzucato, where the public purse is providing this money, but surely the public purse should get some sort of upside, which could help fill some of the funding gaps that, Doctor, that you referred to. So any thoughts on the provision of innovative finance to financial innovation for the provision of long-term capital?
Mark.
Well, I mean, I think firstly, you have to ask the question as to why the public is investing. And we're investing actually we have to invest with a greater risk appetite than private investors, because if private investors would do it, we shouldn't be doing it for them. So one of the things I think we need to be doing is catalysing private investment. But I think it is an interesting question as to the extent to which the public should get a direct return as opposed to the indirect return, which of course when companies grow, they employ people, those people pay taxes. And so there's a quite clear public benefit as well as the new services and products the public get. I mean, Innovate UK has explored and is exploring at the moment loan schemes. So I think it is a live question that we ought to be aware of. I don't know what the right answer is, but it's clear that the public must get a return from that £7.5 billion a year it's spending. And it does go to the question of making sure that return diffuses across the country.
I wish we could continue this for another 2 hours, but sadly our time is drawing to a close. It has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, so I hope you'll join me in thanking Sir Mark, Dr. Hayaatun and Sir Adrian for their contributions to this fascinating topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.